I sat in the sterile waiting room of Peaceful Rest Funeral Home, clutching the tissue box they'd placed on the glass coffee table like some sort of consolation prize. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that sickly yellow glow that made even the artificial flowers look dead. My hands shook as I stared at the contract in front of me, the one that would determine how my own life would be remembered, how my own story would end. The funeral director had left me alone 20 minutes ago, saying my children needed time to discuss the arrangements privately. What he didn't say was that they'd walked out the front door, leaving me to plan my own funeral while they drove, away in their expensive cars. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 68 years, I had planned everything for them: birthday parties, graduations, weddings, baby showers. I had been the orchestrator of every celebration, the silent architect of their happiness. And now, as I faced the planning of my final goodbye, they couldn't even stay in the same building. My phone buzzed. A text from my eldest, Robert. "Mom, we think it's better if you handle the details. You know what you want better than we do. We'll catch up later." Later. As if my death was an inconvenience they'd reschedule around their lunch meetings. I looked around the empty room, past the silk flowers and motivational plaques about eternal peace, and something inside me snapped. Not with anger, though that would come later. It snapped with clarity. Crystal clear, diamond-sharp clarity about who my children really were and what I was going to do about it. My name is Margaret Hall, though everyone calls me Maggie, and for most of my adult life, I believed I was building something beautiful. I thought I was crafting a legacy of love, sacrifice, and family unity that would stretch across generations. What I actually built was a monument to my own naivety, supported by the pillars of my children's greed and held together by my endless capacity to excuse their cruelty as growing pains. I married young, barely 21, to a man named Frank, who had big dreams and an even bigger heart. We settled in Millbrook, a small town in upstate New York where the maple trees turned burgundy every October, and the whole place smelled like apple cider and possibility. Frank worked construction during the day and took accounting classes at night. I taught piano lessons from our tiny living room, saving every penny for the house we'd buy someday, the family we'd raise, the life we'd share. We had 3 children, in 5 years. Robert came first, serious and intense even as a baby, followed by Patricia, who charmed everyone with her dimpled smile and dramatic flair, and finally David, our surprise blessing who arrived when I thought we were done having babies. Frank used to joke that we'd created our own little corporation, with each child bringing their own special talents to the family business of happiness. Frank died when David was only 12. A heart attack at 43, sudden and merciless. One morning he was drinking coffee and reading me funny parts from the newspaper, and by evening I was a widow with 3 children, a mortgage, and no idea how to be strong enough for what came next. But I was strong enough. I had to be. I sold Frank's tools to keep us afloat those first few months, took a job at the bank during the day, and kept teaching piano in the evenings. I learned to fix leaky faucets and change oil in the car. I attended every parent-teacher conference, every soccer game, every school play. When Robert needed money for college, I took out a second mortgage. When Patricia wanted a wedding that looked like something from a magazine, I liquidated my retirement savings. When David struggled to find his footing after college, I supported him for 3 years while he figured out his path. I told myself this was what mothers did. This was love in action. Every sacrifice was an investment in their futures. Every dollar spent was a down payment on their happiness. I pictured family gatherings where they'd tell their own children stories about Grandma Maggie, who never let them want for anything, who moved mountains to make their dreams come true. The house in Millbrook became the center of our universe. I turned the formal dining room into a game room where the grandchildren could play. I kept the spare bedrooms ready for whenever the kids needed to visit or stay over. Every holiday, every birthday, every milestone celebration happened in my house, at my table, with me cooking and cleaning and coordinating while they relaxed and enjoyed. Robert became a successful attorney in Albany, married a woman named Helen who looked at me like I was something she'd scraped off her shoe. They had 2 children, Emma and Jack, who I saw maybe 3 times a year despite living only an hour away. Patricia moved to Boston, became a marketing executive for a pharmaceutical company, and married a doctor named Charles. She had 1 daughter, Sophie, who I adored but rarely got to see. David eventually found his calling in real estate, moved to Phoenix, and married a lovely woman named Lisa. They remained childless by choice, something Patricia never failed to criticize during our rare family phone calls. As the years passed, I noticed the subtle changes. The visits became shorter and less frequent. The phone calls turned into texts, then emails, then nothing unless they needed something. When I brought up feeling lonely, Robert would remind me that they all had busy lives and demanding careers. When I suggested family trips or reunions, Patricia would cite scheduling conflicts and budget constraints. When I offered to visit them instead, David would mention how small their guest room was and how hectic their social calendar had become. I started to feel like I was chasing shadows, trying to maintain relationships with people who saw me as a convenience rather than a person. But I kept trying because the alternative was admitting that I had failed at the one thing I thought I'd succeeded at: creating a loving, connected family. The first real crack in my delusion came 3 years ago, when I fell and broke my hip while cleaning gutters I should have hired someone else to clean. I was alone for 6 hours before a neighbor found me lying in my driveway. At the hospital, I called all 3 children. Robert said he'd try to get away from work but couldn't promise anything. Patricia was in the middle of a big campaign launch and couldn't leave Boston. David offered to fly out, but I told him not to worry, that I'd be fine. I spent 4 days in the hospital and 2 weeks in rehabilitation, learning to walk again. Not one of my children visited. They sent flowers, made a few phone calls, and promised to check on me soon. Robert's wife Helen sent a card with a generic message about healing thoughts. Patricia texted me links to articles about hip fracture recovery. David called twice, but spent most of both conversations talking about his latest real estate deals. I hired a home health aide named Carmen, a gentle woman from El Salvador who treated me with more tenderness and concern than my own children had shown. Carmen helped me understand that my fall wasn't just an accident, it was a wake-up call. My body was getting older, my house was getting harder to maintain, and my children were getting more comfortable with treating me like an afterthought. But I still made excuses for them. They were busy, successful, important people with important responsibilities. I was just their mother, and mothers were supposed to understand, to be patient, to love unconditionally without expecting much in return. The second crack came last Christmas, when I hosted what I didn't know would be our final family gathering. I spent weeks preparing, decorating the house like a winter wonderland, cooking all their favorite dishes, buying thoughtful gifts for everyone. Robert arrived late and spent most of dinner checking his phone for work emails. Patricia complained about the temperature in the house, the softness of the guest bed, and the limited Wi-Fi signal. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. David seemed more interested in the football game on television than any conversation with his family. But it was the conversation I overheard that shattered what remained of my illusions. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when I heard them talking in the living room. They thought I couldn't hear them over the running water, but their voices carried more clearly than they realized. "She's getting older," Patricia was saying. "We need to start thinking about what comes next." "The house is way too big for her," Robert added, "and it's probably worth a fortune now. The market in this area has exploded." "She's stubborn, though," David chimed in. "You know how she is about change. She'll want to stay here until she dies." "Well, maybe that's not such a bad thing," Patricia said. and they all laughed. Actually, laughed. I stood frozen at the kitchen, sink, soap suds dripping from my hands, listening to my children discuss my future like I was a piece of property they needed to manage. They weren't concerned about my happiness or well-being. They were concerned about real estate values and inheritance logistics. That night, after they'd all left to return to their important lives, I sat in my empty house surrounded by dirty dishes and discarded wrapping paper, and I finally admitted the truth to myself. My children didn't love me. They tolerated me. They saw me as an obligation, a burden, an asset to be managed until it was time to liquidate. But even then, even with that painful clarity burning in my chest, I couldn't quite bring myself to believe they were truly heartless. I told myself that maybe they were just going through a phase, that maybe they'd remember what I meant to them when it really mattered. I was about to find out exactly how wrong I was. The third and final crack came 6 months later, when my doctor delivered news that changed everything. Dr. Sarah Chen had been my physician for over a decade, and I trusted her completely. She was thorough, compassionate, and direct in a way that left no room for false hope or sugar-coated realities. "Maggie," she said, settling into the chair across from me in her office, "the test results show that you have pancreatic cancer. It's stage 3, which means it's advanced but potentially treatable with aggressive chemotherapy and surgery." The words hit me like a physical blow. Pancreatic cancer. I knew enough about cancer to understand that this was serious, possibly fatal. I also knew that the treatment would be grueling, expensive, and require a strong support system. "What does that mean in terms of time?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Dr. Chen folded her hands in her lap. "With treatment, we're looking at anywhere from 18 months to 3 years. Without treatment, probably 6 to 12 months. But Maggie, I want you to know that we've made significant advances in cancer treatment, and you're strong for your age. I think you should seriously consider fighting this." I nodded, taking in the information with the same methodical approach I'd used to manage household budgets and family crises for decades. This was just another problem to solve, another challenge to face. The difference was that this time, I wouldn't be facing it alone. My children would rally around me, put aside their busy schedules and petty concerns, and remember what family really meant. Or so I thought. I called Robert first, reaching him at his law office in Albany. His secretary put me through immediately when I said it was urgent. "Mom, what's wrong? Are you okay?" I took a deep breath. "Robert, I need to tell you something important. I just came from the doctor, and I've been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer." Silence. A long, heavy silence that stretched until I wondered if the call had dropped. "Robert, are you there?" "Yes, I'm here. I'm just processing this. Cancer. How bad is it?" I explained what Dr. Chen had told me about staging, treatment options, and prognosis. Robert listened without interrupting, and I could hear him typing on his computer keyboard while I talked. "Okay," he said when I finished. "This is obviously serious. What do you need from us?" "What do you need from us? Not how can we help you through this. Not we'll be there for you. Not we love you and we'll figure this out together. What do you need from us?" Like I was a client presenting a business proposal. "I need my family," I said simply. "I need to know that you'll be here for me during treatment. I need to know that I won't be going through this alone." "Of course, Mom. We'll figure something out. I'll call Patricia and David and we'll discuss how to handle this. Can you email me the doctor's information and your treatment plan once you have it? Handle this, like I was a project that needed managing." I called Patricia next, catching her between meetings at her office in Boston. Her reaction was more emotional than Robert's, but not in the way I'd hoped. "Oh my God, Mom. Cancer? Are you sure? Did you get a second opinion?" You know doctors can be wrong about these things. When I assured her that Dr. Chen was thorough and that I trusted her diagnosis, Patricia's tone shifted. Well, what are your options? I mean, at your age, is treatment even advisable? At my age, I was 68, not 98. I was healthy, active, and had every intention of fighting this disease with everything I had. But apparently, my daughter had already written me off. The doctor thinks I'm a good candidate for treatment, I said carefully. But it's pancreatic cancer, Mom. Everyone knows that's basically a death sentence. And the treatment is so harsh. Maybe you should consider quality of life over quantity of life. Quality of life over quantity of life. My own daughter was suggesting I should just give up and die quietly rather than inconvenience everyone with medical appointments and chemotherapy schedules. David's reaction was the most honest, and therefore the most hurtful. That sucks, Mom. I'm really sorry. What can Lisa and I do to help from here? From here. From Phoenix. From 2,000 miles away, where he could express concern without having to actually do anything about it. I don't know yet, I admitted. I'm still figuring out what the treatment will involve. Well, keep us posted. And if you need anything financial help with medical bills or whatever, just let us know. Financial help. Not emotional support, not physical presence, not family solidarity in the face of crisis. Just money, the easiest gift to give and the least personal way to show you care. Over the following days, as I researched treatment options and scheduled appointments with oncologists, I waited for my children to call back with plans for how they'd support me through this battle. I imagined Robert taking time off work to drive me to appointments. I pictured Patricia coming home for a few weeks to help me organize my treatment schedule. I envisioned David flying out to spend quality time with me before chemotherapy made me too sick for visitors. Instead, I got a group text message 3 days later. Hi, Mom. We've been talking, and we think it would be best if you moved closer to one of us so we can help with your care. Robert thinks there are good cancer centers. Near Albany, Patricia knows some excellent doctors in Boston, and David says Phoenix has great weather for recovery. Let us know what you think. Love, R, P, and D. Let us know what you think. As if my opinion mattered in their calculations. As if they hadn't already decided that the easiest solution was to uproot me from the town where I'd lived for 47 years, the house where I'd raised them, the community where I had friends and connections and a lifetime of memories. I stared at that text message for an hour, reading it over and over again, trying to find some hidden warmth or genuine concern beneath the clinical efficiency of their proposed solution. But there was nothing there except convenience. Their convenience. That's when I understood that my children saw my cancer diagnosis not as a tragedy or a challenge we'd face together, but as a logistics problem that needed to be solved with minimal disruption to their established lives. I wasn't their beloved mother who deserved their time and attention during my darkest hour. I was a burden that needed to be managed as efficiently as possible. I never responded to that group text. Instead, I made my own plans. I chose my own oncologist, Dr. Michael Torres, who worked at the regional medical center just 30 minutes from my house. I scheduled my own appointments, arranged my own transportation, and prepared to fight for my life with the same determination I'd once used to fight for their happiness. But something had fundamentally changed inside me during those 3 phone calls and that group text. For the first time in my adult life, I stopped making excuses for my children's behavior. I stopped convincing myself that they were just busy, or overwhelmed, or going through temporary phases of selfishness. I finally saw them clearly. And what I saw broke my heart in a way that cancer never could. They were strangers who happened to share my DNA. They were people I had sacrificed everything to raise, who had taken every gift I'd given them and offered. Nothing in return except polite distance and calculated concern. They were, in every way that mattered, lost to me already. And that realization, painful as it was, set me free. Dr. Torres outlined an aggressive treatment plan that would involve 6 months of chemotherapy followed by surgery if the tumors responded well to treatment. The chemotherapy would make me sick, tired, and weak. I would lose my hair, my appetite, and probably 20 pounds I couldn't afford to lose. But I was determined to fight, not because I had so much to live for, but because I refused to let my children have the satisfaction of watching me give up. I started treatment on a Tuesday in September, exactly 4 months after my diagnosis. Carmen, my former home health aide, had agreed to come back and help me during the worst days of each cycle. She was the closest thing I had to family now, this kind woman who barely knew me, but who showed up anyway because she believed I was worth showing up for. Robert called once during my first month of chemo, a perfunctory check-in that lasted less than 10 minutes. Patricia sent a care package filled with herbal teas and motivational books about positive thinking. David called twice, both times when he was driving somewhere and had time to kill. None of them visited. None of them offered to take time off work to help me through treatment. None of them suggested that maybe, just maybe, they should be present for their mother's fight against a disease that might kill her. And that's when I started planning. Not just for my recovery, though I was determined to beat this cancer. I started planning for justice. I started planning for the moment when my children would finally understand exactly what they had lost through their years of casual cruelty and calculated indifference. I started planning their bankruptcy. But first, I had to survive. And surviving, as it turned out, was going to require more strength than I'd ever imagined I possessed. The chemotherapy was brutal, turning my body into a battleground where poison fought poison, and I was caught in the crossfire. Carmen stayed, with me during the worst days, holding my hair back when I vomited, bringing me ice chips when I couldn't keep water down, sitting beside my bed during the long nights when pain and nausea made sleep impossible. On the good days, when the side effects receded enough for me to think clearly, I researched. I studied my children's financial situations with the same methodical attention I'd once devoted to household budgets and meal planning. I learned about Robert's law practice, his mortgage, his children's private school tuition. I discovered Patricia's credit card debt, her expensive lifestyle, her precarious position at a company that was rumored to be downsizing. I found out about David's leveraged real estate investments, his business loans, his dependence on rental income from properties he'd bought with money he didn't have. All 3 of my children had built their adult lives on a foundation of debt and assumption. They lived in expensive houses they couldn't afford, drove cars that cost more than I'd made in a year when they were children, and maintained lifestyles that depended on credit and speculation and the promise of future inheritance. My inheritance. The house in Millbrook that Patricia had mentioned was worth a fortune. The savings account that Robert assumed would help pay for his children's college educations. The life insurance policy that David had asked about during one of his rare phone calls. They were counting on my death to solve their financial problems. They had factored my demise into their long-term planning. And that knowledge gave me a power I'd never possessed before the power of their expectations turned against them. By December, after 3 months of chemotherapy, Dr. Torres had good news. The tumors were shrinking. My body was responding to treatment better than he'd dared hope. If the progress continued, I would be a candidate for surgery in the spring. And surgery might mean cure rather than just extended survival. I was going to live. And my children, who had already written me off and moved on with their lives, had no idea what was coming. The Christmas after my diagnosis arrived like a storm. I could see coming but couldn't avoid. By then, the chemotherapy had stolen 30 pounds from my frame and most of the hair from my head, leaving me looking like a scarecrow version of myself. I'd bought a wig, a sensible auburn style that Carmen helped me adjust, but it never felt quite right. It was like wearing someone else's identity. I waited for one of my children to suggest coming home for the holidays. I waited for a phone call asking how I was feeling, whether I was strong enough to cook, if I needed help with anything. The silence stretched through November and into December, broken only by Patricia's brief text asking if I was still doing. The whole Christmas thing this year. The whole Christmas thing. As if 47 years of Christmas mornings, Christmas dinners, Christmas traditions were just some elaborate performance I'd been putting on for my own amusement. I responded that yes, I would be celebrating Christmas as always, and anyone who wanted to join me was welcome. What I got back was a series of excuses that had clearly been coordinated among the three of them. Robert's family had committed to spending Christmas with Helen's parents in Florida. Patricia and Charles were taking Sophie on a cruise to the Caribbean. David and Lisa had booked a ski trip to Colorado months ago and couldn't cancel. All three of my children had made elaborate vacation plans for the holidays, none of which included their cancer-stricken mother. The message was clear. Christmas with Mom wasn't worth changing expensive travel arrangements. Carmen offered to spend Christmas Day with me, but I declined. She had her own family, her own traditions, and I refused to be the pitiful old woman who imposed on others' celebrations. Instead, I decided to create my own new tradition. I would spend Christmas Day doing exactly what I wanted to do, not what family obligation demanded. I woke up that morning in my own bed, in my own house, with sunlight streaming through the windows Frank had installed 30 years ago. I made myself coffee in the kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals for people who couldn't be bothered to check if I was alive or dead. I put on my favorite classical music, Vivaldi's Four Seasons, and I sat in the living room where my children had once opened presents with squeals of delight and pure joy. And for the first time in months, I felt peace. Not happiness, not sadness, just profound peace. I wasn't lonely, I was alone, and there was a difference. Loneliness is wanting company you can't have. Being alone is choosing solitude over disappointing relationships. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done before. I called my attorney, Donald Brennan, at home on Christmas Day. Don had handled my legal affairs for over 20 years, ever since Frank died and I needed help navigating probate and estate planning. He'd become more than just my lawyer. He was one of the few people who truly understood the dynamics of my family. "Maggie," he said, sounding surprised but pleased to hear from me. "Merry Christmas. How are you feeling?" "I'm having a very clear day, Don, and I need to make some changes to my will." There was a pause. "On Christmas Day?" "On Christmas Day. Because today is the day I finally stopped lying to myself about who my children really are." Don didn't ask questions, didn't try to talk me out of anything. He simply said, "I'll open the office tomorrow morning. Can you be there at 9?" The day after Christmas, I sat in Don's office with a cup of coffee and a legal pad filled with notes I'd made the night before. My handwriting was shakier than it used to be, a side effect of the chemotherapy, but my thoughts were crystal clear. "I want to revoke the current will entirely," I told him. "Everything, the house, the savings, the life insurance, all of it." Don raised his eyebrows. "That's a significant change, Maggie. Are you sure you want to disinherit your children completely?" "I'm not disinheriting them," I said carefully. "I'm redistributing my assets to people and organizations that have actually shown they care whether I live or die." I'd thought about this extensively during the long nights when chemo-induced insomnia kept me awake. Carmen would receive the house in Millbrook, along with enough money to maintain it for the rest of her life. She had shown me more genuine care and affection in 6 months than my children had shown me in 6 years. Dr. Torres would receive a substantial donation to fund cancer research because he had fought for my life when my own family had given up on it. The local library would receive my collection of first edition books because they had provided me with refuge and entertainment when I was too sick to leave the house. Several charities would benefit as well, organizations that supported cancer, patients without family support, programs that helped elderly people age in place, scholarships for children whose parents couldn't afford college tuition. My money would go to people who understood the value of help because they genuinely needed it. Not to people who saw inheritance as an entitlement they'd already spent in their minds. "What about your children? Dawn asked gently. Even a small bequest might. Each of them will receive exactly $1, I interrupted. Not because I'm vindictive, but because I want it legally clear that I didn't forget them. I want them to understand that their inheritance reflects the amount of consideration they showed me during the last year of my life. Dawn nodded slowly. And if they contest the will? Then they'll spend more on legal fees than they could ever hope to. Recover. I'm not doing this out of spite, Dawn. I'm doing this because I finally understand that love should be reciprocal, and inheritance should be earned. The new will was executed in January, while I was between chemotherapy cycles and strong enough to think clearly. Dawn arranged for witnesses who could attest to my mental competency, and he video recorded the signing to prevent any future claims that I'd been coerced or confused. On the recording, I stated clearly that I was of sound mind, that I understood the contents of the will, and that this distribution reflected my true wishes based on how I'd been treated by my beneficiaries during my illness. But changing my will was only the first step in what I'd begun to think of as my justice project. My children's financial situations were more precarious than they'd ever admitted, and I had the power to expose just how much they'd been counting on my death to solve their problems. Robert's law practice was struggling more than he'd let on. I discovered this not through any particular investigative skill, but through a casual conversation with Millie Patterson, whose nephew worked as a paralegal at Robert's firm. According to office gossip, Robert had been depending on a few large personal injury cases to keep the practice afloat, and when those cases settled for less than expected, he'd found himself in serious financial trouble. He'd taken out a business loan using his house as collateral, and he'd been using credit cards to pay basic business expenses for months. Helen's expensive tastes hadn't helped. They lived in a house they couldn't afford, drove cars they couldn't pay for, and maintained a lifestyle that required Robert to bill more hours than were probably available in a week. Patricia's situation was even more dire. Her pharmaceutical company had been acquired by a larger corporation, and while the merger had been presented as a growth opportunity, the reality was widespread layoffs and restructuring. Patricia's position as a marketing executive was exactly the kind of high-salary, questionable value job that new management loved to eliminate. She'd been living on borrowed time and borrowed money for months, using credit cards to maintain her lifestyle while she searched for a new position that might not exist. Charles, her doctor husband, had his own problems. He'd invested heavily in a medical practice partnership that had gone sour when one of the partners was accused of insurance fraud. Charles wasn't involved in the fraud, but he was financially tied to the practice and would likely lose a significant amount of money when the partnership dissolved. David's real estate empire was the most impressive-looking and the most fragile of all. He'd leveraged himself to the absolute limit, buying rental properties with minimal down payments and depending on rental income to cover his mortgages and business loans. When the Phoenix rental market softened and two of his major tenants moved out within the same month, David found himself with more debt than income and no way to cover the shortfall. All three of my children were living paycheck to paycheck, despite earning more money than Frank and I had ever dreamed of making. They'd built their financial lives like houses of cards, and they were all desperately hoping that my death would provide the wind that would blow their problems away. What they didn't know was that I was about to become the earthquake that would bring everything crashing down. In February, 6 months after my diagnosis, Dr. Torres delivered the news I'd been hoping for. The tumors had shrunk enough to make surgery possible, and if the surgery was successful, I might be looking at years of life instead of months. The operation was scheduled for early March, and the recovery would be long and difficult, but the possibility of actual cure was now on the table. I called my children to share the news, curious to see how they'd react to the possibility that I might survive longer than they'd planned. Robert's response was carefully neutral. "That's great news, Mom. I'm sure you're relieved." Patricia was more direct. "But it's still cancer, right? I mean, There's no guarantee that surgery will cure it completely. David actually sounded disappointed. Oh, well, that's good, I guess. How long is the recovery supposed to take? None of them offered to come home for the surgery. None of them suggested taking time off work to help during my recovery. They were all clearly hoping I'd decline the surgery and stick to the original timeline that had me dead by Christmas. Instead, I scheduled the surgery and arranged for Carmen to stay with me during recovery. I also did something else. I called each of my children and asked for a favor. I need to borrow some money, I told Robert during our phone call. The insurance doesn't cover all of the surgical costs, and I'm short about $15,000. Robert was quiet for a long moment. Mom, you know things are tight for us right now. Helen's been wanting to redo the kitchen, and the kids' tuition is due soon. I'm not asking for a gift, I clarified. I'm asking for a loan. I'd pay you back within 6 months. I'll have to talk to Helen about it, he said finally. Let me see what we can do. I made similar calls to Patricia and David, asking each of them for help with different aspects of my medical expenses. Patricia claimed that Charles's practice problems made it impossible for them to lend money right now. David explained that he had all his cash tied up in real estate investments and couldn't access it without taking significant losses. Not one of my children was willing to lend their potentially dying mother $15,000. The same, children who were expecting to inherit a house worth over $500,000, plus my savings and life insurance, couldn't find $15,000 between them to help with my medical care. But I wasn't actually short $15,000. My insurance was excellent, and I had savings that could easily cover any out-of-pocket expenses. I was testing them, and they had failed spectacularly. The surgery was scheduled for March 15th, and as the date approached, I made my own preparations. I arranged for Carmen to stay at the house while I was in the hospital. I gave her detailed instructions about medications, emergency contacts, and household management. I also gave her something else, copies of certain financial documents that would become very important in the coming months. The night before surgery, I sat in my kitchen and wrote 3 letters, one to each of my children. Not goodbye letters, though they would probably assume that's what they were. These were truth-telling letters, and I intended for them to be delivered at exactly the right moment. The letters explained everything I'd discovered about their financial situations. They detailed the research I'd done into their debts, their poor decisions, their dependency on my inheritance to solve problems they'd created through their own greed and irresponsibility. The letters also explained that I'd been testing their willingness to help me during my illness, and that they'd failed every test I'd given them. But the most important thing the letters explained was what I'd done about it. I'd changed my will, yes, but that was only part of my plan. I'd also done something much more immediate and devastating. Over the past several months, while they'd been ignoring my illness and planning how to spend my inheritance, I'd been quietly calling in some favors and sharing some information. I'd spoken to Robert's biggest client about some irregularities I'd noticed in his billing practices. Nothing illegal, just ethically questionable overcharges that the client might want to investigate. I'd had a conversation with Patricia's new boss about her habit of padding expense reports and claiming credit for other people's work. Again, nothing criminal, just unprofessional behavior that might affect her job security. I'd contacted David's business partners about his tendency to inflate property values and hide maintenance costs from potential tenants. I'd also made some strategic financial moves. Remember the $15,000 I'd asked to borrow? I'd actually loaned money to each of their major creditors, with the understanding that those loans could be called in at any time. Robert's business loan, Patricia's credit card debt, David's investment loans, they were all now partially owned by their mother, and I had the power to demand immediate repayment. The letters explained all of this in detail. They explained that, while my children had been treating me like an inconvenience, I'd been positioning myself to become their worst nightmare. They explained that their financial problems were about to become much worse, and that the inheritance they'd been counting on would not be available to save them. The final paragraph of each letter was identical. "You have spent the last year treating me like I was already dead. Now you'll have the opportunity to discover what your life would actually look like if I was gone." I sealed the letters and placed them in my safe, with instructions for Carmen to deliver them if I didn't survive the surgery. If I did survive, I would deliver them myself at precisely the right moment. The surgery took 8 hours. Dr. Torres removed the tumors, along with parts of my pancreas and surrounding tissue that had been affected by the cancer. The recovery was brutal, even worse than chemotherapy in its own way, but the pathology results were everything I'd hoped for. Clear margins, no sign of remaining cancer cells, every indication that the surgery had been successful. I would live, I would recover, and I would have years, possibly decades, to watch my children reap the consequences of their selfishness. The first visitors I received during my week-long hospital stay were Carmen and Dr. Torres. Carmen brought flowers from my garden and updates about the house. Dr. Torres brought good news about my healing and cautious optimism about my long-term prognosis. My children did not visit. Robert called once, Patricia sent a card, and David texted to ask how I was feeling. When I was discharged from the hospital, none of them offered to help with my transportation home or my recovery care. But Carmen was there. She drove me home, helped me into my own bed, and made me soup that I could actually keep down. She was the one who celebrated with me when I took my first walk around the block 3 weeks after surgery. She was the one who held my hand when the pathology results came back clear. During my recovery, something interesting began to happen. Robert's biggest client did indeed decide to investigate his billing practices, and they discovered enough irregularities to justify ending their contract and demanding a refund of overcharges. Patricia's job evaluation revealed performance issues that resulted in her being placed on probation just before the company announced another round of layoffs. David's business partners became suspicious about his property valuations and initiated an audit that revealed discrepancies that violated their partnership agreement. Within 6 weeks of my surgery, all 3 of my children were facing financial crises that threatened to destroy the lifestyles they'd built on debt and assumption. And the inheritance they'd been counting on to save them was no longer available. But I wasn't ready to reveal my hand yet. I wanted them to struggle a little longer, to understand what desperation felt like, to experience the kind of helplessness I'd felt when they abandoned me to plan my own funeral. Because the best part of my plan was still to come. By May, I was strong enough to drive again, and I decided it was time for some family visits. Not because I missed my children, but because I wanted to see firsthand how their financial troubles were affecting them. I drove to Albany first, arriving at Robert's house unannounced on a Saturday afternoon. The house looked the same from the outside, but I could see signs of stress if you knew what to look for. The lawn needed work, there were small maintenance, issues that hadn't been addressed, and Helen's expensive car was nowhere to be seen. Robert answered the door looking haggard. He'd lost weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant worry. "Mom," he said, clearly surprised. "What are you doing here?" "I was in the area and thought I'd stop by," I lied smoothly. "I wanted to see how you're doing." He invited me in reluctantly, and I could see why. The house that had once been Helen's pride and joy was showing signs of financial strain. The expensive artwork was gone from the walls. The designer furniture had been replaced with cheaper alternatives, and there was a general air of diminished circumstances that no amount of cleaning could hide. Emma and Jack, my grandchildren, greeted me with genuine enthusiasm. They were 8 and 10 now, old enough to notice that their parents were stressed but too young to understand why. Emma showed me her latest school project, and Jack demonstrated a magic trick he'd learned from a library book. They were beautiful children, and for a moment I felt a pang of regret about the distance that had grown between us. But then Helen appeared, and the moment of softness evaporated. She looked terrible. Frankly, her usually perfect hair was showing gray roots, her designer clothes had been replaced with department store basics, and she had the pinched look of someone who was constantly worried about money. "Margaret," she said coolly, "how nice of you to drop by." Helen had never liked me, and I'd never particularly liked her, but we'd maintained a polite facade for Robert's sake. Now, with their financial world crumbling around them, she seemed to have abandoned even the pretense of courtesy. "How are you feeling?" Robert asked, clearly hoping to fill the awkward silence. "Much better," I said cheerfully. "The surgery was successful, and Dr. Torres thinks I have an excellent chance of complete recovery." I watched their faces carefully as I said this. Robert looked genuinely relieved, but Helen's expression flickered with something that might have been disappointment. They'd been counting on my death more than I'd realized. We made awkward conversation for about an hour. Robert mentioned that business was slow, Helen complained about the cost of everything these days, and the children chattered about school and friends and summer plans that probably wouldn't happen due to their parents' financial situation. As I prepared to leave, Robert walked me to my car. "Mom," he said quietly, "about that loan you asked for back in February. I'm sorry we couldn't help. Things have been really difficult lately." "Don't worry about it," I said warmly. "I found another way to handle the expenses." He nodded, looking relieved, and I could practically see him calculating how much longer he'd have to wait for his inheritance. Little did he know that his inheritance was already gone, and his financial problems were about to get much worse. My visit to Patricia in Boston was even more revealing. She and Charles had moved from their expensive brownstone to a smaller apartment in a less fashionable neighborhood. Patricia tried to play it off as downsizing for convenience, but I could see the truth in her defensive explanations and Charles's embarrassed silence. Sophie, now 13, was clearly struggling with the changes in her family's circumstances. She'd always been a confident, outgoing child, but now she seemed anxious and withdrawn. When Patricia went to the kitchen to make coffee, Sophie confided that her parents had been fighting a lot about money and that she was worried they might get divorced. "They think I don't understand what's happening," she whispered, "but I hear them talking at night. Daddy lost a lot of money at work, and Mommy might lose her job." My heart broke for this child who was paying the price for her parents' poor decisions and inflated expectations. Sophie was innocent in all of this, just as Emma and Jack were innocent. They were the real victims of their parents' selfishness and financial irresponsibility. Patricia returned with coffee and immediately began complaining about her job situation. The company was restructuring, her position was uncertain, and she was having trouble finding comparable work elsewhere. She hinted broadly that it might be nice if family members with more financial security could help out during this difficult time. "It's so hard," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I never thought we'd be in a position like this. Thank God we have family to fall back on if things get really bad." Family to fall back on. She meant me, of course. She was already planning how to tap into my resources when her situation became completely untenable. The irony was breathtaking. The same daughter who couldn't spare $15,000 for her mother's medical expenses was now expecting her mother to bail her out of a financial crisis she'd created through her own poor choices. "I'm sure things will work out," I said neutrally. "They usually do." Patricia nodded eagerly. "Exactly. And Charles is looking into some new investment opportunities that could really turn things around for us." Charles, who had been quietly reading a newspaper, looked up sharply. "I told you, Patricia, those deals are too risky. We can't afford to lose any more money right now." "But if we don't take some risks, how are we going to get back to where we were?" Patricia snapped. I watched this exchange with fascination. They were at each other's throats, desperate and angry and looking for someone to blame for their situation. Soon, they'd have someone to blame. They just didn't know it yet. My visit to David and Lisa in Phoenix was the most illuminating of all. They were still living in their expensive house, still driving their luxury cars, still maintaining the appearance of success. But I could see the cracks in their facade more clearly than my other children could hide theirs. The house was beautiful, but it was clearly over-leveraged. David mentioned casually that they'd refinanced twice in the past year, and Lisa let slip that they'd had to let their housekeeper go and cancel their country club membership. When I asked about their business, David's cheerful demeanor faltered, slightly. "The market's been challenging," he admitted. "But that's just the nature of real estate. You have ups and downs." What he didn't say was that he was facing foreclosure on 3 of his rental properties and that his business partners were pressuring him to buy them out of the partnership. Lisa, who had always been the more honest of the two, looked increasingly uncomfortable as David painted an optimistic picture of their situation. After dinner, while David was taking a business call, Lisa and I sat on their back patio overlooking the desert. The sunset was spectacular, all orange and purple and gold, but Lisa barely seemed to notice it. "Margaret," she said quietly, "I'm worried about David. He's been so stressed lately, and he won't admit how bad things really are." I waited for her to continue. "We might lose the house," she whispered, "and the business is falling apart. David thinks he can fix everything if he just works harder, but I don't think working harder is going to solve this problem." Lisa was the only one of my children's spouses who had ever treated me with genuine warmth and respect. She was also the only one who seemed to understand that their current lifestyle was unsustainable and that David's optimism was based more on wishful thinking than financial reality. "What will you do?" I asked gently. She shrugged helplessly. "I don't know. David keeps talking about borrowing money from family, but his parents are on a fixed income and my parents don't have anything to spare. I guess we'll just have to see what happens." Borrowing money from family. There it was again, the assumption that I would be their financial safety net when their house of cards finally collapsed completely. During the flight home from Phoenix, I made a decision. It was time to accelerate my timeline. My children were all suffering, but they were still hoping for salvation that would never come. They were still making plans based on inheritance money they would never receive. They were still treating me like a bank they could withdraw from whenever their poor decisions caught up with them. It was time for them to learn the truth. It was time for them to understand that their mother wasn't dead yet, and that the money they'd been counting on was never coming. It was time to deliver the letters. But first, I had one more stop to make. I needed to visit Peaceful Rest Funeral Home, where this whole story had begun, and where it was about to take a very unexpected turn. I walked into Peaceful Rest Funeral Home on a Tuesday morning in late June, 6 months after my children had abandoned me there to plan my own service. The same receptionist sat behind the polished oak desk, though she looked surprised to see me walking through the door under my own power. "Mrs. Hall," she said, rising from her chair with a confused smile, "how can we help you today?" "I'd like to speak with Mr. Richardson about planning a service," I said calmly. Her confusion deepened. "Oh, I see. Has there been another loss in your family?" "In a manner of speaking, yes." "Mr. Richardson appeared within minutes, the same funeral director who had left me alone in that sterile room while my children drove away without a backward glance. He was a tall, thin man with prematurely gray hair and the practiced expression of perpetual sympathy that all funeral directors seem to master. "Mrs. Hall," he said, extending his hand, "I'm so sorry for your loss. Please, come into my office and we can discuss the arrangements." I followed him into the same office where I'd sat months earlier, contemplating my own mortality while my children calculated the value of my estate. But this time, I wasn't the grieving, abandoned woman who had been left to face death alone. This time, I was in complete control. "Mr. Richardson," I said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I need to plan 3 services for my children. They'll be needing them very soon." He blinked several times, clearly struggling to process what I'd just said. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hall, but I'm not sure I understand. Are your children ill?" "They're about to be dead to me," I said simply. Which, in my family, is the only kind of death that really matters. I could see him trying to figure out whether I was having some sort of breakdown or making a very dark joke. The truth was somewhere in between. "What I mean," I clarified, "is that I'm planning to cut all ties with my children, and I want to mark that occasion with the same formality they would have received if they had actually died. I want 3 memorial services, complete with flowers, programs, and everything else you'd normally provide for a funeral. Except instead of celebrating their lives, we'll be mourning the end of our relationships." Mr. Richardson leaned back in his chair, clearly uncertain how to respond. "Mrs. Hall, this is a very unusual request. I'm not sure that you provide services for families who need closure," I interrupted. "That's exactly what I need. Closure. My children have been dead to me for months. I just want to make it official." He was quiet for a long moment, probably calculating whether this strange request would be profitable enough to justify the awkwardness. Finally, he cleared his throat. "What exactly did you have in mind?" For the next hour, I outlined my plan, in detail. I wanted 3 separate memorial services, each one tailored to reflect the specific ways my children had disappointed me. Robert's service would focus on the death of professional integrity and family loyalty. Patricia's would mourn the loss of gratitude and basic human decency. David's would commemorate the end of honesty and responsibility. Each service would include flowers, music, and a program with photos from when they were children, before they became the selfish strangers they were now. I would invite their friends, colleagues, and neighbors not to tell them that my children were actually dead, but to announce that I was officially severing all family ties and that anyone who wanted to maintain relationships with both sides would need to choose. "Mrs. Hall," Mr. Richardson said when I finished explaining, "this is certainly creative, but don't you think it might be more productive to try family counseling or mediation before taking such a drastic step?" I smiled at him, the same patient smile I'd given hundreds of people over the years who had suggested that my children's behavior could be fixed with understanding and communication. "Mr. Richardson," I said, "have you ever tried to have a relationship with someone who sees you as an ATM machine rather than a human being?" He shook his head. "Then trust me when I say that some relationships are beyond repair. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for everyone involved is to admit that it's over and move on with dignity." He named a price that was probably twice what the services would actually cost, expecting me to balk at the expense. Instead, I wrote him a check on the spot. "When would you like to schedule these services?" he asked, clearly resigned to helping me with my unconventional request. "Next month," I said. "I'll let you know the exact dates after I deliver some information to the guests of honor." I left Peaceful Rest Funeral Home feeling lighter than I had in months. For too long, I'd been carrying the weight of one-sided relationships, hoping, against evidence, that my children would remember how to love me the way I'd always loved them. Now I was finally ready to put that burden down. But before I could hold my memorial services, I had some final business to take care of. It was time to call in the debts and spring the traps I'd been setting for months. The first call I made was to Robert's biggest client, the personal injury lawyer who had been questioning Robert's billing practices. I'd been feeding him information for weeks, and now I had the final piece of evidence he needed to justify demanding a full audit of Robert's work. "Mrs. Hall," he said when I called, "I wanted to thank you for bringing those billing irregularities to my attention. We've completed our review, and we've found enough questionable charges to justify terminating our contract with your son's firm." "I appreciate you taking this seriously," I said. Robert has always had a tendency to cut corners when he thinks no one is watching. Well, someone was watching, he said grimly. We'll be demanding a refund of the overcharges and we'll be reporting this to the Bar Association for review. Robert's law practice would survive this, but barely. He'd lose his biggest client, face professional sanctions, and have to repay thousands of dollars he'd already spent. Combined with his existing debt load, this would push him to the edge of bankruptcy. The second call was to Patricia's supervisor, at the pharmaceutical company. I'd been having regular conversations with Janet Morrison, the new regional manager who was evaluating Patricia's performance as part of the restructuring process. Mrs. Morrison, I said, I have some additional information about my daughter's work habits that might be relevant to your evaluation. I'd been documenting Patricia's questionable expense reports and her habit of taking credit for other people's work for months. I had copies of emails, receipts, and witness statements from colleagues who were tired of Patricia's dishonesty, but afraid to speak up themselves. This is very thorough documentation, Janet said after I'd sent her the evidence. I have to ask, Mrs. Hall, why are you providing this information about your own daughter? Because she's been lying to you, and lying is a pattern with her, I said simply. She's been lying to her family for years about her financial situation, her work performance, and her basic integrity. I thought her employer should know what kind of person they're dealing with. Patricia would be fired within the week, officially for performance issues, but really because the company couldn't trust her not to lie about everything from expense reports to project timelines. With Charles's medical practice falling apart, and Patricia unemployed, they'd be facing bankruptcy within months. The third call was to David's business partners in Phoenix. I'd been in regular contact with them since February, gradually revealing the discrepancies in David's property valuations and the corners he'd been cutting with maintenance and tenant screening. Mr. Thompson, I said when I reached David's senior partner, I have the final documentation we discussed about the property misrepresentations. David had been inflating property values to justify higher rents and hiding maintenance costs to make his investments look more profitable than they actually were. His partners had been suspicious for months, but they hadn't had proof until I provided it. Mrs. Hall, I have to say, this is quite a comprehensive investigation you've conducted into your son's business practices. I've had a lot of time on my hands while recovering from cancer surgery, I said. And I've learned a great deal about what my children have been doing while they thought I was too sick to pay attention. David would be forced to buy out his partner's shares of the business at a time when he couldn't afford to make his current loan payments. The partnership dissolution would trigger immediate repayment demands on several business loans, and David would lose everything within weeks. But the most devastating calls were the ones I made to the creditors I'd been quietly acquiring influence over for months. Remember those loans I'd asked my children for? The $15,000 they'd all refused to provide for their dying mother's medical care? I'd used that money, plus quite a bit more, to purchase portions of their outstanding debts from credit card companies, business loan providers, and mortgage holders. Robert's business loan was now partially owned by his mother. Patricia's credit card debt was now partially controlled by the woman she'd abandoned at Christmas. David's real estate investments were now leveraged against money borrowed from the mother he'd refused to visit during her cancer treatment. And as the holder of those debts, I had the legal right to demand immediate repayment. The letters I'd written months earlier were still sitting in my safe, but I decided they were too gentle for what I wanted to accomplish now. Instead, I wrote new letters. These were not explanations or attempts at reconciliation. These were formal notifications that our family relationships were over and that they should not expect any financial assistance from me, now or ever. Each letter also included a detailed accounting of their current debts, their financial obligations, and the timeline for when their various creditors would be demanding payment. I wanted them to understand exactly how much trouble they were in before I revealed my role in creating that trouble. The letters were delivered on the same day, a Friday in July, by certified mail requiring signature confirmation. I wanted to be sure each of my children received their notification personally, and that I had legal proof they'd been informed of my decision. Robert's letter was delivered to his law office at 10:30 a.m. Patricia's arrived at her apartment in Boston at 1:15 p.m. David received his at his real estate office in Phoenix at 4:45 p.m. local time. Then I sat back and waited for the phone calls to begin. Robert called first, barely 2 hours after signing for his letter. His voice was shaking with anger and disbelief. "Mom, what the hell is this letter supposed to mean? You're cutting me out of your will because I couldn't lend you money for medical bills. That's insane." "Hello, Robert," I said calmly. "I'm fine. Thank you for asking. The surgery went well, and I'm recovering nicely." "Don't play games with me," he snapped. "This letter says you've changed your will and that you're not leaving me anything. You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. I'm also completely healthy, despite your apparent disappointment about that fact." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that I know you've been counting on my death to solve your financial problems. It means I know about your business troubles, your debt load, and your desperate need for inheritance money to keep your life from falling apart." Silence. "I also know," I continued, "that you couldn't find $15,000 to help your cancer-stricken mother, but somehow found money for Helen's kitchen renovation and the children's private school tuition. So, yes, I've changed my will. And no, you won't be receiving an inheritance." "You can't do this," Robert said, his voice rising. "That money is supposed to be for your children. It's supposed to help secure our futures. My money is supposed to go to people who treated me with love and respect during the last year of my life. You don't qualify." "But I'm your son." "Being my son was an accident of birth," I said. "Acting like my son would have been a choice. You chose not to." The line went dead. He'd hung up on me, which was probably the most honest response he'd given in years. Patricia called 3 hours later, and she was crying before I even said hello. "Mom, I just got your letter, and I don't understand. Why are you being so cruel? I know we haven't been perfect children, but we've been dealing with so much stress lately." "Hello, Patricia. How nice to hear from you. This is the first time you've called since my surgery, by the way." "I've been working constantly trying to keep my job," she sobbed. "And Charles has been having such a hard time with the practice situation. We've been barely holding everything together." "Yes, I know about your job situation. I also know about Charles's partnership problems and your credit card debt and your mortgage payments. I know about all of it, Patricia." "How could you possibly know about all that?" "Because while you've been ignoring my existence, I've been paying attention to yours. I know you've been living beyond your means for years. I know you've been counting on my inheritance to bail you out of your poor financial decisions. And I know you couldn't spare $15,000 to help with my medical expenses, but somehow found money for a Caribbean cruise at Christmas." "That cruise was already paid for," she protested. "So were my medical bills, as it turned out." "I was testing you, Patricia. I wanted to see if you cared enough about my survival to help when I asked for help. You failed that test." "You were testing us? That's manipulative and horrible." "What's manipulative and horrible is spending a year treating your mother like she's already dead and then expecting her to leave you money when she actually dies." Patricia's crying intensified. "Please don't do this, Mom. I'm sorry we haven't been better children. I'm sorry we haven't been more supportive. But cutting us out of your will isn't going to solve anything." "It's not supposed to solve anything," I said. "It's supposed to reflect reality. You don't love me, Patricia. You love my money. Now, you can't have either one." She hung up without saying goodbye. David's call came late that evening, after he'd had time to absorb the letter and probably discuss it with Lisa. He sounded tired rather than angry, which was somehow more heartbreaking than his siblings' rage and tears. "Mom," he said quietly, "Lisa and I just read your letter. We want you to know that we're sorry. We know we haven't been good children lately." "Lately?" I asked. "David, when was the last time you visited me without wanting something?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I don't remember." "Neither do I." "When was the last time you called just to see how I was doing?" "I don't know." "When was the last time you told me you loved me and meant it?" Silence. "David," I said gently, "I know you're facing financial problems. I know the real estate business is falling apart and that you might lose everything. I also know you've been hoping that my inheritance would save you from the consequences of your poor decisions. How do you know all that? Because I'm your mother, and mothers pay attention even when their children think they're not watching. The question is, what are you going to do now that you know the safety net isn't there?" "I don't know," he whispered. "I really don't know." "Then I suggest you figure it out quickly. Because the financial problems you've been hiding are about to become very public, and the family money you've been counting on is going to people who actually treated me like family." "Mom," he said, and for just a moment he sounded like the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. "Is there any way to fix this? Is there anything we can do to make this right?" I felt a flicker of the old maternal instinct, the urge to comfort and forgive and pretend that love could overcome years of neglect and disrespect. But I pushed it down. "David," I said, "if you have to ask what you can do to make this right, then you don't understand what you did wrong. And if you don't understand what you did wrong, then you can't really fix it." "Please don't do this," he said, and now he was crying too. "I'm not doing anything to you, David. I'm doing something for me. I'm choosing to spend my remaining years with people who actually want me in their lives." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and cried. Not for my children, who had made their choices and would have to live with the consequences. I cried for myself, for the mother I'd been, who had loved so completely and received so little in return. I cried for the grandmother I'd never really been allowed to be, for the family gatherings that would never happen, for the relationships that could have been beautiful if my children had been different people. But mostly, I cried tears of relief. The burden of one-sided love was finally off my shoulders. The weight of unmet expectations was gone. The exhausting work of excusing their behavior and hoping for change was over. When the tears stopped, I made myself a cup of tea and called Carmen to tell her about the memorial services I'd planned. "Señora Maggie," she said, laughing despite herself, "you are loca, but also brilliant. Your children, they need to understand what they lost." "They're about to understand a lot of things," I said. "But first, I need to make sure everyone else understands too." The next phase of my plan involved making sure that my children's friends, colleagues, and neighbors knew exactly why I was cutting them out of my life. I wasn't going to let them tell people that their mother was crazy or vindictive or suffering from some sort of mental breakdown. I wanted everyone to know the truth about what kind of children they really were. I started with Robert's law partners. I called each of them personally to explain that I would no longer be providing financial support to Robert's practice, and that they should not expect any family money to help with his legal troubles. "Mrs. Hall," his senior partner said, "I'm sorry to hear about your family difficulties. Robert has mentioned that you've been dealing with health issues." "I've been dealing with cancer," I said. "And during my treatment and recovery, Robert was dealing with billing irregularities and ethical violations. I thought you should know that his family will not be helping him resolve those problems." I made similar calls to Patricia's colleagues, explaining that she would not be receiving family financial support during her unemployment, and that anyone who wanted to maintain a relationship with both of us should understand that Patricia had chosen money over family loyalty. With David, I called his business associates and real estate contacts to let them know that the Hall family money would not be available to bail him out of his failed investments. "I want to make sure everyone understands," I told his former business partner, that David made his financial decisions based on inheritance money that was never guaranteed and is now no longer available. His family will not be helping him avoid the consequences of his poor judgment. But the most important calls were the ones I made to my grandchildren's schools, teachers, and activity coordinators. I wanted to make sure that Emma, Jack, and Sophie would continue to receive birthday cards, holiday gifts, and college fund contributions from their grandmother, even though their parents were no longer part of my life. I want to be very clear, I told Emma's school counselor, that my relationship with my son Robert is over, but my relationship with my granddaughter continues. I will still be attending her school events and providing financial support for her education. Her parents' poor choices should not affect her opportunities. I made similar arrangements for Jack and Sophie, setting up trust funds that would pay for their college educations and provide them with financial security that their parents' poor decisions couldn't touch. My grandchildren were innocent victims in this family breakdown, and I wasn't going to let them suffer because their parents had chosen greed over love. The memorial services were scheduled for consecutive Saturdays in August. Robert's would be first, followed by Patricia's, then David's. I sent formal invitations to everyone who had ever been part of their lives: friends, colleagues, neighbors, extended family members, even their children's teachers and coaches. The invitations were elegantly printed on high-quality cardstock, with a black border and formal language that made them look exactly like funeral announcements. Each one read, "Margaret Hall requests your presence at a memorial service celebrating the life and mourning the death of her relationship with child's name. The deceased relationship was 68 years old and passed away after a long illness caused by neglect, ingratitude, and emotional abandonment. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to organizations that support cancer patients without family support." I included photos of each child from their younger years, when they had still been capable of genuine love and affection. I wanted people to see what I was mourning the children they used to be before they became the strangers they were now. The responses to the invitations were fascinating. Some people were confused, thinking there had been some sort of mistake. Others were intrigued, recognizing the creative justice of what I was doing. A few were horrified, thinking I'd lost my mind with grief or medication. But many people, particularly those who had watched my children's behavior over the years, responded with understanding and support. They had seen how Robert, Patricia, and David treated me. They had noticed the one-sided nature of our relationships. They understood that sometimes the only healthy response to toxic family members is to formally end the relationship and move on. Mr. Richardson at Peaceful Rest Funeral Home called to confirm the final details for the services. "Mrs. Hall," he said, "I have to admit, when you first proposed this idea, I thought it was rather unusual. But the more I've thought about it, the more I think you might be on to something. Sometimes people need closure even when no one has actually died." "Exactly," I said. "My children have been dead to me for a long time. These services will just make it official." "Will your children be attending their own memorial services?" "They haven't been invited," I said. "This isn't for them. This is for me and for everyone else who needs to understand that some relationships are beyond saving." The week before the first memorial service, something unexpected happened. Carmen answered my phone one afternoon while I was resting, and when she came to tell me who had called, she looked puzzled. "Senora Maggie," she said, "there was a young man on the phone. He said his name was Jack, and he is your grandson. He wants to speak with you about his father, Jack." My 10-year-old grandson had somehow found my phone number and called to talk about the situation with Robert. I took the phone with shaking hands. "Grandma Maggie?" His voice was small and uncertain. "Hello, sweetheart. How did you get my phone number?" "I found it in Dad's office." "Grandma, why is Dad so upset about money? He and Mom keep talking about how you're not giving us any money anymore, and Dad is really angry." My heart broke. This child was caught in the middle of a situation he couldn't possibly understand, suffering because of his parents' greed and my need for justice. Jack, I said carefully, your father and I have had some disagreements about family matters. But I want you to know that this has nothing to do with you or Emma. You will always be my grandchildren, and I will always love you. Are you really not going to give Dad any money? Jack, that's between your father and me. But I promise you that you and Emma will be taken care of. I've made sure of that. Dad says you're being mean because you're sick and the medicine is making you confused. I'm not confused, sweetheart. I'm healthier than I've been in months, and I'm not being mean. I'm just making sure that my money goes to people who have shown they care about me. I care about you, Grandma. I know you do, Jack, and that's why you'll always have a place in my life, even if your father doesn't. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and stared at the wall for a long time. My children were already poisoning their own children against me, using them as weapons in a war they had started through their own selfishness. But I wasn't going to let their manipulation change my plans. If anything, Jack's call reinforced my decision to cut ties with his parents while maintaining relationships with him and his sister. They deserved better than parents who would use them to guilt-trip their grandmother into providing money. The memorial services would go on as planned. My children's relationships with me were dead, and it was time to bury them with the dignity they had never deserved, but that I was going to provide anyway, because that's what good mothers do, even when their children don't deserve it. The first memorial service was scheduled for Saturday morning at 10 o'clock. I arrived at Peaceful Rest Funeral Home an hour early, wearing the black dress I'd bought for Frank's funeral 30 years ago. It still fit, though it hung a little looser now after the weight loss from chemotherapy. Carmen had helped me with my makeup and the auburn wig that had become my armor against the world's pity. The main chapel had been decorated exactly as I'd requested. White lilies and yellow roses filled the space, the same flowers I'd chosen for Robert's first communion when he was 8 years old. A large photograph of Robert as a child sat on an easel near the podium, showing him gap-toothed and grinning, holding a baseball bat almost as tall as he was. Below the photo, an elegant placard read, "In memory of the loving relationship between Margaret Hall and her son Robert, born 1955, died 2023. Mr. Richardson approached me as I stood surveying the arrangements. "Mrs. Hall, everything is prepared, as you requested. I have to say the response to your invitations has been quite remarkable. We're expecting nearly 60 guests. 60 people. More than had attended Frank's actual funeral. I wondered how many of them were coming out of genuine support for my decision, and how many were simply curious about the spectacle of a mother formally disowning her son. The first guests began arriving at 9:30. I was surprised to see Dr. Torres enter with his wife Maria. He spotted me immediately and crossed the room with a warm smile. "Maggie," he said, taking my hands in both of his, "I have to tell you, this is the most creative approach to family therapy I've ever encountered. I'm not trying to fix anything, Dr. Torres. I'm just trying to finish it with dignity." Maria nodded approvingly. "Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is walk away from people who make you sick, even if they're family." More guests arrived steadily. I was touched to see several of my former students from my teaching days, now adults with children of their own. Mrs. Patterson from down the street came with her sister. Even Donald Brennan, my attorney, attended with his wife. But the most surprising arrival was Helen, Robert's wife. She entered the chapel looking haggard and nervous, glancing around as if she expected to be thrown out. When she spotted me, she approached hesitantly. "Margaret," she said quietly, "I hope it's all right that I came. I know you probably don't want to see me." I studied her face, looking for signs of the arrogance and disdain that had characterized her attitude toward me for years. Instead, I saw something I'd never seen before: genuine remorse. "Why are you here, Helen?" She twisted her hands nervously. "Because I owe you an apology. And because I need you to know that not everything that happened was Robert's idea. I raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I mean that some of the distance, some of the coldness, it came from me. I was jealous of how much Robert loved you when we first got married. I felt like I was competing with you for his attention. So I started suggesting that we skip visits, that we make other plans for holidays. I made him choose between keeping me happy and spending time with you. This was not what I had expected to hear. I'd assumed Helen's dislike of me was simply a matter of social snobbery, not an active campaign to separate Robert from his family. And Robert chose to keep you happy, I said. Yes, and I thought I was winning something. But watching him this past week, seeing how destroyed he is by your letter, I realize what I actually won was the destruction of his relationship with the person who loved him most in the world. Helen's eyes filled with tears. He's been crying, Margaret. Actually crying. Not about the money, not about the inheritance, about you, about losing you. I don't think he fully understood what he'd given up until it was gone. I felt a familiar flutter of the old maternal instinct, the urge to comfort and forgive and rush to heal the wound. But I pushed it down firmly. Helen, I said gently, I appreciate you telling me this. But Robert is a grown man who made his own choices. You may have influenced those choices, but you didn't force them. He could have said no to you. He could have insisted on maintaining our relationship. He chose not to. She nodded miserably. I know. I just wanted you to know that he's suffering, and that I'm sorry for my part in causing this. Before I could respond, she turned and walked to a seat in the back of the chapel. I watched her go, feeling a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. It was validating to know that my instincts about Helen's influence had been correct. But it was also heartbreaking to realize how easily Robert had been willing to sacrifice our relationship for domestic peace. At exactly 10 o'clock, Mr. Richardson called for everyone to take their seats. I had prepared remarks for each memorial service, not because I wanted to speak publicly about my family's failures, but because I wanted to create a record of what had really happened. Too many family breakdowns occur in private, with each side telling their own version of events. I wanted there to be no doubt about why I was ending these relationships. I walked to the podium and looked out at the assembled guests. Some faces were familiar, others were strangers who had been part of Robert's life in ways I'd never known about. Several people had their phones out, probably recording what they expected to be either a touching tribute or a spectacular breakdown. Thank you all for being here today, I began, my voice steady and clear. We're gathered to mourn the death of my relationship with my eldest son, Robert Michael Hall. This relationship was 68 years old when it died, after a long illness caused by neglect, indifference, and emotional abandonment. A murmur rippled through the room. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Robert was born on September 15, 1955, during one of the worst blizzards in upstate New York history. The roads were impassable, and I was in labor for 14 hours before the doctor could reach us. From the moment he took his first breath, Robert was the center of my universe. He was a serious child, thoughtful and responsible beyond his years. When his father died, Robert stepped up to help me raise his younger siblings. He was my rock, my partner in keeping our family together. I paused, looking at Helen in the back row. Her face was streaked with tears. The Robert I'm mourning today was kind, generous, and devoted to his family. He would have moved mountains to help someone he loved. He would have sacrificed anything to ease his mother's suffering. That Robert has been dead for quite some time, replaced by someone who sees family relationships as transactions and inheritance as an entitlement. Another pause. I could see people throughout the room nodding in recognition. The final blow to our relationship came when I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Instead of rallying around me during the most frightening time of my life, Robert and his siblings calculated how much my death would be worth to them financially. When I asked for a small loan to help with medical expenses, Robert couldn't find the money. When I needed emotional support during chemotherapy, Robert was too busy to call. When I faced surgery that might save my life, Robert was disappointed that I might live longer than he'd planned. The murmur grew louder. Several people were openly crying now. Today we say goodbye to the relationship that could have been, and we acknowledge the reality of what it became. Robert chose money over love, convenience over loyalty, and selfishness over family bonds. Those choices killed our relationship as surely as cancer might have killed my body. The difference is that cancer can be treated with surgery and medicine. The death of love can only be treated with acceptance and moving forward. I returned to my seat as Mr. Richardson took the podium to announce that anyone who wished to share memories of my relationship with Robert was welcome to speak. I hadn't expected anyone to take him up on this offer, but I was wrong. Mrs. Patterson stood first. She was 83 years old and had lived across the street from me for over 40 years. She walked slowly to the podium, leaning heavily on her cane. "I've watched this family for 4 decades," she said, her voice thin but clear. "I watched Maggie raise those children alone after Frank died. I watched her work 2 jobs to keep them fed and clothed. I watched her sacrifice everything for their happiness." She paused, looking directly at Helen. "And I've watched those children take everything she gave and offer nothing in return. What happened to this family is a tragedy, but it's not Maggie's tragedy. She loved completely and purely for 68 years. The tragedy belongs to the children who were too selfish to love her back." Mrs. Patterson's words seemed to open a floodgate. One by one, people stood to share their observations about my relationship with Robert and their disappointment in his treatment of me. Dr. Torres spoke about the strength I'd shown during cancer treatment and his shock at learning that none of my children had visited me in the hospital. Carmen talked about finding me alone and frightened after my hip surgery, with no family members willing to help with my recovery. But the most powerful testimony came from someone I hadn't expected to see. Janet Morrison, Patricia's former supervisor from the pharmaceutical company. "I only met Mrs. Hall a few months ago," she said, when she contacted me about her daughter's work performance. "At first, I thought she was just a vindictive mother trying to cause trouble for her child. But as she provided more and more documentation of Patricia's dishonesty and professional misconduct, I realized that this was a woman who valued integrity above family loyalty. She could have stayed silent and let Patricia continue to lie and cheat and take credit for other people's work. Instead, she chose to protect the company and the colleagues who were being harmed by her daughter's behavior. That takes a kind of moral courage that most parents don't possess." The service lasted nearly 2 hours. When it was over, people lingered in the chapel, reluctant to leave. Many approached me to offer support and share their own stories of difficult family relationships. I was struck by how many people had experienced similar situations: children who took advantage of their parents' love, family members who saw relationships as opportunities for financial gain, relatives who disappeared during times of crisis and reappeared when inheritance was being discussed. As the chapel finally emptied, Helen approached me one last time. "Margaret," she said, "is there anything Robert could do to fix this? Anything at all?" I considered her question carefully. "Helen, if Robert had called me the day after he received my letter and said, 'Mom, I've been a terrible son, and I want to spend the rest of my life making it up to you,' then maybe we could have found a way forward. But instead, he called to argue about money. He was angry about losing his inheritance, not about losing me. That tells me everything I need to know about his priorities." She nodded sadly. "He's been talking about hiring a lawyer to contest the will." "He's welcome to try," I said. "But he'll discover that my attorney is much better than he is, and that I documented everything very thoroughly. He'll spend more money on legal fees than he could ever hope to recover, and he'll lose anyway." "What about Emma and Jack? They're asking about you constantly." This was the question I'd been dreading. My grandchildren were innocent victims in this situation, and I had no desire to hurt them or deprive them of their grandmother's love. The trust funds I've established for Emma and Jack will ensure that they can attend college and have financial security regardless of their parents' poor decisions. As for my relationship with them, that will depend on whether Robert and you are willing to put their needs ahead of your anger about the inheritance. What do you mean? I mean that if Robert wants his children to have a relationship with their grandmother, he'll have to accept that this relationship comes with conditions. Emma and Jack are welcome in my life, but Robert is not. If he can't handle that arrangement, then he'll be depriving his own children of their grandmother's love out of spite. Helen's face crumpled. He'll never agree to that. His pride won't. Let him. Then he'll be hurting his children to protect his ego, I said, which, frankly, sounds exactly like something the current version of Robert would do. After Helen left, I sat alone in the empty chapel for a few minutes. The flowers still looked beautiful. The photograph of young Robert still smiled from the easel, and I felt a profound sense of completion. Not happiness, exactly, but closure. One relationship down, 2 to go. Patricia's memorial service was scheduled for the following Saturday. I spent the week fielding phone calls from people who had attended Robert's service, many of whom wanted to know if they were invited to the next one. The word about my unconventional approach to family estrangement was spreading through social media and local gossip networks. I was becoming something of a minor celebrity in Millbrook, the woman who had publicly divorced her children. The attention was both gratifying and exhausting. For decades, I had suffered in silence as my children's behavior became increasingly selfish and hurtful. I had made excuses for them, covered for them, and protected their reputations even as they were destroying our relationships. Now, finally, the truth was public, and people were responding with understanding and support rather than the judgment I had feared. Patricia's service was different from Robert's in tone and attendance. Where Robert's memorial had felt like a community gathering to support a wronged mother, Patricia's felt more like an intervention or an exorcism. The chapel was fuller this time, with nearly 80 guests, including several of Patricia's former colleagues who had driven up from Boston specifically to attend. I had chosen different flowers for Patricia's service, pink roses and white carnations, the same arrangement I'd used for her Sweet 16 party. The photograph on the easel showed Patricia at age 7, dressed as a fairy princess for Halloween, her face glowing with innocent joy and mischief. The placard read, "In memory of the loving relationship between Margaret Hall and her daughter Patricia Ann, born 1958, died 2023. The crowd included more hostile faces this time. Several of Patricia's friends from Boston had made the trip, and I could see from their expressions that they had heard Patricia's version of events and were here to bear witness against me. I didn't mind. I had nothing to hide anymore. Charles, Patricia's husband, arrived just before the service began. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, and I noticed that his hands were shaking as he found a seat near the back. Unlike Helen, he made no attempt to approach me or offer explanations for his wife's behavior. My remarks for Patricia's service were more pointed than they had been for Robert's, because Patricia's betrayal had been more personal and more cruel. Patricia was born on February 14, 1958, I began, which seemed like a sign that she would be a child of love and warmth. She was bright, charming, and creative from an early age. Patricia could convince anyone of anything with her smile and her dramatic flair. She was the child who brought laughter into our house during the darkest days after her father's death. I looked out at the assembled guests, noting the mix of sympathy and skepticism on their faces. The Patricia I'm mourning today was generous, with her affection and grateful for the sacrifices others made on her behalf. She understood that love was a gift that should be treasured, not a resource that should be exploited. That Patricia has been dead for years, replaced by someone who sees relationships as opportunities and family loyalty as a one-way street. Several of Patricia's Boston friends were whispering among themselves, clearly disagreeing with my characterization of events. I continued anyway. Patricia's death blow to our relationship came in the form of casual cruelty. While I was fighting cancer, she found time to plan a Caribbean cruise, but couldn't find time to visit her mother. When I asked for a small loan to help with medical expenses, she claimed financial hardship while living in expensive homes and maintaining a lifestyle she couldn't afford. When I needed emotional support during the darkest period of my life, Patricia offered motivational books and herbal tea instead of her presence. The whispering stopped. Even Patricia's supporters seemed to recognize the reality of what I was describing. But the final insult came when I discovered that Patricia had been lying to her employer about her work performance while lying to her family about her financial situation. She was living a double life, pretending to be successful and responsible while actually being dishonest and irresponsible in every area of her existence. When I chose honesty over family loyalty and shared information about her professional misconduct with her employer, Patricia accused me of betrayal. But you cannot betray someone who has already betrayed themselves. This prompted several gasps from the Boston contingent. Apparently, Patricia hadn't told her friends about the circumstances of her firing. Today, we mourn the relationship that could have been built on truth, mutual respect, and genuine affection. Instead, we acknowledge that Patricia chose deception over honesty, selfishness over loyalty, and financial gain over love. Those choices killed our relationship as surely as any disease. When I finished speaking, there was a long silence. Then, unexpectedly, Charles stood and walked to the podium. He looked at me with an expression that was part apology and part resignation. "Mrs. Hall," he said, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need to say something." He turned to face the assembled guests. "I've been married to Patricia for 15 years, and everything Mrs. Hall just said is true. Patricia has been lying about her work situation, her financial problems, and her relationship with her mother. I've watched her treat her family like an ATM machine while claiming to be the victim of their unreasonable expectations." The Boston friends were staring at Charles in shock. This was clearly not what they had expected to hear. "I love my wife," he continued, "but I can't pretend anymore that her behavior toward her mother has been acceptable. Mrs. Hall spent a year fighting cancer while Patricia spent that same year planning how to spend her inheritance. When Mrs. Hall needed help, Patricia was too busy. When Mrs. Hall needed support, Patricia was too stressed. But when Mrs. Hall had money to leave behind, Patricia was suddenly very interested in maintaining family relationships." Charles paused, his voice breaking slightly. "I'm a doctor. I've watched hundreds of families deal with serious illness. I've seen children drop everything to care for their parents. And I've seen children abandon their parents when caregiving became inconvenient. Patricia abandoned her mother when caring became inconvenient. And now she's angry that her mother chose not to reward that abandonment with an inheritance." He looked directly at me. "Mrs. Hall, I'm sorry for my wife's behavior and for my own. Failure to insist that she treat you better. You deserved so much more from both of us." Charles returned to his seat as the chapel buzzed with conversation. His testimony had completely undermined whatever narrative Patricia's friends had come prepared to support. Several other speakers followed, including two of Patricia's former colleagues who had made the trip from Boston specifically to thank me for exposing her dishonest work practices. They shared stories about projects Patricia had sabotaged, credit she had stolen, and colleagues she had thrown under the bus to protect herself. "Mrs. Hall did us a favor by sharing that information," one of them said. "Patricia was a cancer in our department, and her mother had the courage to provide the chemotherapy." The metaphor was harsh, but effective. By the time the service ended, even Patricia's most loyal friends seemed to understand that there were two sides to this story, and that my side was supported by considerably more evidence. As guests filed out of the chapel, I noticed that several of the Boston contingent approached Charles to express their shock at learning the truth about Patricia's behavior. He handled their questions with the same quiet dignity he had shown during his impromptu testimony. Before leaving, Charles approached me one final time. "Mrs. Hall," he said, "I want you to know that Sophie is asking about you constantly. She doesn't understand why she hasn't seen her grandmother in so long." Sophie, my 13-year-old granddaughter, who was just entering those crucial teenage years when a grandmother's support could make such a difference. "Charles," I said carefully, "Sophie is welcome in my life any time, but like Emma and Jack, her relationship with me cannot include her mother. If Patricia wants Sophie to have a grandmother, she'll have to accept that the grandmother comes without the inheritance she was expecting." "I'll talk to Patricia about it," he said, "but I can't promise she'll be reasonable. She's very angry right now." "She's angry because she got caught," I said. "People who live honestly don't get this angry when the truth comes out." After Charles left, I sat in the empty chapel surrounded by Patricia's flowers and photographs. 2 down, 1 to go. But David's service would be different, because David himself was different. Of all my children, he was the one I had held out the most hope for, and therefore the one whose betrayal had cut the deepest. The week between Patricia's service and David's passed quietly. The media attention had intensified after Patricia's memorial, with local newspapers and even a regional television station requesting interviews about my divorce from my children. I declined all media requests. This wasn't about publicity or revenge, it was about closure and truth-telling. But the attention did bring unexpected contact from people who had been touched by my story. I received letters and phone calls from other parents who had experienced similar situations with ungrateful children. Many of them thanked me for having the courage to make my family dynamics public, saying that my example had inspired them to set better boundaries with their own toxic family members. One letter particularly moved me. It came from a woman in California whose adult children had abandoned her when she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. She wrote, "Dear Mrs. Hall, I watched the video of your son's memorial service online, and I cried for an hour afterward. Not because I was sad, but because I was relieved to know that I'm not the only mother who has been discarded by her children when loving them became inconvenient. Your courage in speaking the truth has given me permission to stop making excuses for my children's behavior and start protecting myself from their cruelty. Thank you for showing me that love should be reciprocal and that family relationships should be earned, not demanded." Letters like this one reminded me that my situation wasn't unique and that my decision to make it public might help other people recognize and address similar dynamics in their own families. David's memorial service was scheduled for the 3rd, Saturday in August. As I prepared for it, I found myself feeling different than I had before the previous 2 services. Robert and Patricia had both hurt me through their selfishness and neglect, but David's betrayal felt more personal because it had been more unexpected. David had always been my baby, the child who came as a surprise when I thought my family was complete. He had been sweet and affectionate as a young child, the one who crawled into my bed during thunderstorms and told me he loved me every night before sleep. Even as an adult, David had maintained a warmer relationship with me than his siblings had. He called more often, visited more regularly, and seemed genuinely interested in my life and well-being. That's what made his abandonment during my cancer treatment so devastating. I had expected Robert and Patricia to fail me, because they had been failing me gradually for years. But David's indifference had come as a shock that nearly broke me. As I dressed for his memorial service, I found myself grieving not just for the relationship we'd lost, but for the illusion of love that had sustained me for so long. David had been my last hope, my final evidence that I had succeeded as a mother. Learning that his apparent affection had been as shallow and conditional as his siblings had been the final blow to my identity as a successful parent. The chapel was packed for David's service with well over 100 guests. Many had driven up from Phoenix, including several of his former business associates and real estate colleagues. Lisa was there, sitting in the front row and crying before the service even began. I had chosen yellow roses and white daisies for David's memorial, the same flowers I'd used for his high school graduation party. The photograph showed him at age 5, missing his 2 front teeth and grinning as he held a fishing pole that was bigger than he was. The placard read, "In memory of the loving relationship between Margaret Hall and her son, David James. Born 1963, died 2023." My remarks for David's service were the most emotional of the 3 because David's betrayal had been the most complete. "David was born on March 22, 1963, I began, my voice already shaking with emotion. "He was our surprise blessing, the child who completed our family in ways we hadn't even known we needed. David was gentle and loving from the very beginning. He was the child who brought me dandelions from the yard, who drew pictures of our family on every available surface, who told me every day that I was the best mommy in the whole world." I paused to compose myself, looking out at Lisa's tear-stained face. The David I'm mourning today was honest, loyal, and deeply committed to the people he loved. He would have sacrificed anything for his family's happiness. He would have moved across the country to care for his mother during her illness. That David has been dead for years, replaced by someone who sees family relationships as networking, opportunities and inheritance as a business investment. The chapel was silent except for the sound of Lisa's quiet sobs. David's final betrayal was not just his absence during my cancer treatment, though that absence was devastating. His final betrayal was the discovery that his apparent love and concern had been carefully calculated performances designed to maintain his position as my favored child and primary heir. While I was fighting for my life, David was building real estate investments based on money he expected to inherit when I died. He had turned my potential death into a business plan. Several people gasped at this revelation. I had not shared the extent of David's financial planning around my inheritance with anyone else. But perhaps the cruelest part of David's betrayal was how effectively he had fooled me. While Robert and Patricia had shown their true colors gradually over many years, David had maintained the pretense of love and loyalty right up until the moment I needed him most. Then, when cancer threatened to disrupt his inheritance timeline, he disappeared just as completely as his siblings had. I was crying now, not just for David, but for my own naivety in believing that one of my children had actually loved me unconditionally. Today, we mourn the relationship that was built on deception and sustained by false hope. We acknowledge that David chose financial gain over family loyalty, convenience over love, and selfishness over the values I thought I had taught him. Those choices killed our relationship and killed something inside me that I will never be able to resurrect. When I finished speaking, the chapel was so quiet that you could hear the air conditioning humming in the background. Then Lisa stood and walked to the podium with shaking legs. "Mrs. Hall," she began, "I need to tell you something that David made me promise never to tell anyone." She turned to face the assembled guests, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "David has been planning for Mrs. Hall's death for over 2 years. Not just financial planning, but actively hoping for it. When she was diagnosed with cancer, he called me at work to tell me that our money problems were finally going to be solved. He said, and I quote, 'Mom won't last long with pancreatic cancer, so we just need to keep her happy until she dies and leaves us the house.'" The gasps were audible throughout the chapel. Even I was shocked by the coldness of David's calculation. I told him that his mother might beat the cancer, that people survive it all the time with good treatment. He said, "At her age, with that diagnosis, survival is unlikely. And even if she does survive, she'll probably need expensive care that will eat up most of the inheritance anyway. Better for everyone if she just accepts her fate and goes quietly." Lisa was crying again, but she continued speaking through her tears. "I should have told you this months ago, Mrs. Hall. I should have warned you about what David was saying and thinking, but I was afraid of losing my marriage, and I convinced myself that he didn't really mean it. I thought that when push came to To shove, he would remember that he loved you and would step up to help. She looked directly at me. I was wrong. When you needed him most, David chose money over love. Just like you said, he chose his investment portfolio over his mother's life. And I chose my marriage over telling you the truth. I'm sorry for both of our failures. Lisa returned to her seat as the chapel erupted in whispered conversations. Her testimony had revealed a level of callousness that went beyond anything I had suspected, even in my darkest moments of disillusionment. Several other speakers followed, including two of David's former business partners who had driven up from Phoenix specifically to share their experiences with his dishonest business practices. They talked about his pattern of hiding problems, from investors, inflating property values to secure loans, and using partnership funds for personal expenses. But the most devastating testimony came from Carmen, who took the podium with quiet dignity. I worked for Senora Maggie during her cancer treatment, she said in her heavily accented English. I was there when she was too sick to get out of bed, when she was too weak to eat, when she was so scared about dying that she couldn't sleep at night. Carmen paused, looking around the chapel with fierce eyes. Do you know how many times her children called during those dark days? Robert called once in 6 months. Patricia sent a care package but never called. David called twice, and both times he spent more time talking about his real estate deals than asking about his mother's health. She turned to look directly at Lisa. I know David's wife knew better. I heard her tell David that he should visit his mother, that he should help with her care, but David always had excuses. Business trips, important meetings, deals that couldn't wait. Carmen's voice rose with indignation. This woman raised 3 children alone after her husband died. She worked 2 jobs to give them everything they needed. She sacrificed her own happiness for their success. And when she needed them most, when she was facing death, they all disappeared like smoke. She pointed at me. But Senora Maggie is strong, stronger than her children ever knew. She beat the cancer, and she beat the sadness they caused her. She learned to love herself the way she had always loved them. And that is the greatest victory of all. Carmen returned to her seat to spontaneous applause that lasted for several minutes. When the chapel finally quieted, no one else stood to speak. Carmen had said everything that needed to be said. As guests began to file out of the chapel, Lisa approached me one final time. Mrs. Hall, she said, I know I don't deserve forgiveness for keeping David's secrets, but I wanted you to know that I'm leaving him. I can't stay married to someone who could talk about his mother's death like it was a business opportunity. I took her hands in mine. Lisa, you were caught in an impossible situation. David put you in the position of choosing between loyalty to him and loyalty to me. I don't blame you for choosing your marriage. But I should have chosen you, she said. You deserve to know the truth. Now I do know the truth, I said, and knowing it has set me free. After Lisa left, I sat alone in the chapel for the last time. 3 memorial services, 3 relationships officially ended, 3 chapters of my life finally closed. I felt exhausted, but also strangely peaceful. The weight of false hope was gone. The burden of one-sided love had been lifted. The exhausting work of making excuses for inexcusable behavior was over. As I prepared to leave, Mr. Richardson approached me with a final invoice for the 3 services. Mrs. Hall, he said, I want you to know that these memorial services have been the most meaningful events we've hosted in years. You've given a lot of people permission to acknowledge the truth about their own difficult family relationships. I looked around the empty chapel one last time. Mr. Richardson, do you think I did the right thing? I think you did the only thing that would allow you to move forward with dignity and peace, he said. Sometimes love means holding on, and sometimes love means letting go. You loved your children enough to finally stop enabling their selfishness. As I drove home from David's memorial service, I realized that my justice project was complete. I had exposed my children's true nature to their communities, ended relationships that had been harming me for years, and created a foundation for rebuilding my life around people who actually valued my presence. But the most important part of my plan was still to come. The bankruptcy proceedings that would destroy my children's financial futures were about to begin, and they still had no idea that their mother was the architect of their destruction. 3 weeks after David's memorial service, the bankruptcy notices began arriving. Robert received his first summons on a Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail to his law office. Patricia's came to her apartment in Boston on Wednesday afternoon. David's was waiting for him when he returned from a business trip to Denver on Thursday evening. Each notice was identical in its cold, legal language. Notice of debt acceleration and demand for immediate payment. The documents detailed the full amount of their outstanding debts that I now controlled, along with the legal requirement for immediate repayment and the consequences of default. Robert owed $287,000 across business loans and personal credit lines. Patricia's debt totaled $156,000 in credit cards and personal loans. David faced the largest obligation at $423,000 in real estate investments and business partnerships. Combined, my 3 children owed over $866,000 to creditors that I now had significant influence over. The notices gave them 30 days to pay in full or begin bankruptcy proceedings. Robert called first, his voice shaking with rage and disbelief. "What the hell is this notice, Mom? It says you own my business debt?" "Hello, Robert," I said calmly. "Yes, I've acquired controlling interests in several of your outstanding obligations. I thought it was time to call in some investments." "This is insane. You can't just buy people's debts to manipulate them." "Actually, I can. It's perfectly legal. Debt is a commodity that can be bought and sold on the open market. I simply chose to purchase some assets that I felt would provide good returns." "Good returns? You're destroying my life." "I'm revealing the life you've already built," I corrected. "A life based on debt, poor decisions, and counting on your mother's death to solve your financial problems. I'm just accelerating the timeline." Robert was breathing heavily into the phone. "You can't do this to your own children." "Robert, you stopped being my child when you chose money over love. Now you're just someone who owes me a great deal of money." He hung up without another word. Patricia's call came an hour later, and she was already crying before I answered. "Mom, please, I don't understand what's happening. This notice says I have to pay everything immediately or file for bankruptcy. I don't have that kind of money." "I know you don't, Patricia. That's rather the point. But why? Why are you doing this to us?" "I'm not doing anything to you. I'm simply collecting on debts that you legitimately owe. The fact that you can't pay them reflects your own poor financial management, not my cruelty. This will ruin me completely. I'll lose everything." "Patricia, you've already lost everything that mattered. You lost your job due to dishonesty, your marriage is failing due to financial stress, and you lost your mother due to selfishness. The bankruptcy is just paperwork." Her sobs grew louder. "Please don't do this. I'll do anything to make things right between us. Anything except what you should have done a year ago when I was dying of cancer." "But I can't change the past." "No, you can't. And I can't change the future you've created for yourself. You'll file for bankruptcy, learn to live within your means, and hopefully develop some character through adversity." She hung up mid-sob. David's call was different. When he spoke, his voice was flat and emotionless, as if he'd already accepted defeat. "Mom, I got the notice. Lisa told me what she said at the memorial service. I guess there's no point in pretending anymore." "No, there isn't." "How long have you known?" "About the real estate investments, the timeline planning, all of it?" "Since February. I've been investigating all 3 of you since your reactions to my cancer diagnosis made it clear that you were more interested in my death than my recovery. So all of this, the memorial services, The will changes, the debt purchases, it was all planned? Every bit of it. You treated me like I was already dead, so I decided to show you what your lives would actually look like without me. David was quiet for a long moment. I deserve this. Yes, you do. What happens to Lisa? She didn't do anything wrong except marry a selfish bastard. This was the first sign of concern for another person that David had shown in months. Lisa will be fine. The debt obligations are in your name only. She can divorce you and walk away clean. She's already filed the papers. Smart woman. Mom, David said quietly, I know it doesn't matter now, but I want you to know that I did love you. I just loved money more. Thank you for that. Honesty, David. It's the first genuine thing you've said to me in years. After he hung up, I sat in my kitchen and felt something I hadn't expected. Satisfaction. Not joy, exactly, but a deep sense of completion. For too long, I had been the only one suffering the consequences of our broken family relationships. Now my children would understand what loss actually felt like. The bankruptcy proceedings unfolded exactly as I had anticipated. All 3 of my children filed within 2 weeks of receiving their notices, having no other choice when faced with immediate payment demands they couldn't meet. Robert's bankruptcy was the most complex, involving both personal and business debts. His law practice survived in name only, operating out of a small shared office space with drastically reduced overhead. Helen filed for divorce 6 weeks after the bankruptcy, citing irreconcilable differences, but really seeking to protect whatever assets she could from Robert's financial collapse. Emma and Jack moved in with Helen's parents while the divorce proceedings continued. I contacted Helen's attorney to ensure that my grandchildren's trust funds would not be affected by their parents' financial troubles. The money I had set aside for their education and future security was completely protected from any bankruptcy claims. Patricia's situation was more straightforward, but equally devastating. With no job prospects and a bankruptcy on her record, she was forced to move in with Charles's elderly parents in a small town outside Boston. Charles had found work at a community health clinic, earning a fraction of his previous income, but at least providing steady employment. Sophie, my 13-year-old granddaughter, struggled with the dramatic change in her family's circumstances. I arranged for her to receive counseling through a trust fund I established specifically for mental health support. Like her cousins, Sophie's future would be secure regardless of her parents' poor decisions. David's bankruptcy was the most complete destruction. He lost all of his real estate investments, his business partnerships, and his house in Phoenix. Lisa's divorce was finalized quickly, with her walking away debt-free as I had predicted. David moved into a small apartment and found work as a sales associate at a commercial real estate firm, earning less in a year than he used to spend on vacation. Throughout this period, I received regular updates from the bankruptcy attorneys, the divorce lawyers, and the various creditors involved in liquidating my children's assets. Watching their financial lives crumble was not pleasurable exactly, but it was profoundly educational. They were learning, perhaps for the first time in their adult lives, that actions have consequences and that poor decisions cannot always be erased by family money. 6 months after the bankruptcy proceedings began, I received an unexpected visitor. Carmen answered the door one afternoon to find a young woman standing on my porch, clearly nervous and unsure of herself. "Is this Margaret Hall's house?" she asked. "I'm Sophie Patterson. I think I'm her granddaughter." Sophie, my beautiful, intelligent granddaughter, now 14, and looking so much like Patricia had at that age that it took my breath away. I invited her in and made her tea while she explained how she had found me. "Mom and Dad told me I couldn't see you anymore because of family problems," she said carefully. "But I missed you so much, and I couldn't understand why you would just disappear from my life. So I looked you up online and found articles about the memorial services." She paused, studying my face for signs of anger or rejection. "I read everything, Grandma. About the cancer, about Mom's job, about the money troubles. I understand why you did what you did." "Do you hate me for it?" I asked gently. No, she said firmly. I'm proud of you. Mom always told me that you were weak and dramatic, but reading about everything you've been through, you seem like the strongest person I know. We spent the afternoon talking about her new life, her struggles with the family's financial collapse, and her hopes for the future. Sophie was mature beyond her years, having been forced to grow up quickly as her parents. World fell apart around her. "Grandma," she said as she prepared to leave, "can I keep visiting you? I know Mom would be angry if she knew I was here, but I need someone in my family who tells the truth. Sophie, you will always have a place in my life. Always. The trust fund I've established for you will ensure that you can attend any college you choose, regardless of your parents' financial situation. And you're welcome in my home anytime." She hugged me tightly before leaving, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope for the future of my family. Not the family I had tried to build with my children, but the new family I was creating with my grandchildren, based on honesty and mutual respect, rather than obligation and financial dependence. Over the following months, Emma and Jack also found ways to visit me despite their parents' objections. Like Sophie, they were intelligent enough to understand that the family's problems were not caused by their grandmother's cruelty, but by their parents' selfishness. The trust funds I had established for them provided not just financial security, but also independence from their parents' manipulation. A year after the memorial services, I attended Emma's school play, Jack's soccer game, and Sophie's debate tournament. Their parents were not present at any of these events, too consumed with their own financial struggles and too proud to acknowledge that their children's grandmother was now their primary source of stability and support. My children had learned what they thought they wanted to know, what their lives would look like without their mother's financial support. The answer was bankruptcy, divorce, and the loss of everything they had built on debt and false expectations. But they had also learned something they hadn't expected: that cutting me out of their lives meant cutting themselves out of their children's lives as well. Emma, Jack, and Sophie had chosen their grandmother over their parents, drawn to honesty and unconditional love rather than financial manipulation and emotional abuse. I was 70 years old now, healthy and cancer-free, surrounded by grandchildren who visited regularly and friends who valued my company. Carmen had become like a daughter to me, and Dr. Torres continued to monitor my health with the dedication of family. My house was full of laughter again, filled with people who wanted to be there rather than people who felt obligated to visit. The woman who had sat alone in Peaceful Rest Funeral Home, planning her own service while her children drove away without a backward glance, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more selective about who deserved her love and attention. My children had taught me the most valuable lesson of my life: that family relationships should be earned, not demanded, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop enabling people to treat you badly. They wanted to know what their lives would look like without me. Now they knew. And I had discovered what my life could look like without them: peaceful, honest, and filled with people who understood that love should be reciprocal. In the end, we had all gotten exactly what we deserved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.